Welcome to Your Education Matters, a source of information about British Columbian education. Your Education Matters features the voices of professional educators and other education stakeholders. Joel Bakan is a professor of law at the University of British Columbia and an internationally renowned legal scholar and commentator. A former Rhodes Scholar and law clerk to Chief Justice Brian Dixon of the Supreme Court of Canada, Bakan has law degrees from Oxford, Dalhousie, and Harvard. His critically acclaimed international book, The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, became a bestseller in several countries. The book inspired a feature documentary film also titled The Corporation, which won numerous awards including Best Foreign Documentary at the Sundance Film Festival. Bakan's highly regarded scholarly work includes Just Words, Constitutional Rights and Social Wrongs, as well as textbooks, edited collections, and numerous others. His new book, Childhood Under Siege: How Big Business Targets Children, has received widespread positive attention for its treatment of North American society's relationship with its children, including what can be seen as our failure to protect and nurture our rising generations. A frequent recipient of awards for both his writing and teaching, Bakan has worked on landmark legal cases and government policy and served regularly as a media commentator, appearing on national television and radio. Recently, Georgia Strait named Professor Bakan Vancouver's best public intellectual. We welcome Joel Bakan to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Joel, my understanding is that Childhood Under Siege has its origins in both your family life and your previous book, The Corporation. Would you explore those origins for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It really was a coming together of those two things. I guess when I was doing The Corporation, I looked at a lot of the issues that I look at in this recent book, but only tangentially. And as I was doing, I was thinking this is a very important issue that I'd like to return to. And also there was a quote from Nelson Mandela that really kind of captured it for me. And he said, "The keenest revelation of a society's soul is how it treats its children." And I thought, there's a lot of truth in that. And so if I'm going to move on from The Corporation and explore these ideas further, it seems that is a good place to look at them. At the same time, I had a couple of young kids at home, and I was increasingly seeing how their lives were being affected profoundly in numerous ways, and I talk about them in the book, by the things that corporations were doing. And it felt almost like the world of big business was this third force that was coming in between me and my kids. And I realized, parenting isn't just about trying to be a good parent to your children. You're not parenting in a vacuum, you're in a context, and that context can make it harder or easier to do a good job in serving their needs and in serving the values you're trying to serve. So that's kind of the animating idea in this book, is that we as a society create conditions for parents to parent and for children to have their childhood. And we need to think about what we're doing in that regard.
And we've made it harder somehow, it seems, to be a good parent, where parents have less control of the environment that their children are growing up in. I take that from what you're saying and reading the book.
Absolutely, and I guess the fundamental idea in the book is that we've kind of unleashed corporations on our children, and in numerous different ways. We've deregulated marketing and media so that basically anything seems fair game in terms of advertising, in terms of content. There's very little regulation, some self-regulation, but it's not very effective. We've unleashed the pharmaceutical industry on our kids, who have seen kids' behavioral issues and behavioral problems as sources for creating drug remedies and therefore profit. We've not paid sufficient attention to the fact that kids are uniquely vulnerable to environmental toxins. We've turned education into an industry rather than a public service, especially in the United States. So in all these different ways, and what I try to do in the book is connect the dots. There's this common theme, and that is that kids are seen as a source of profit making. rather than a group, a vulnerable group that needs our protection.
Well, before we ask why, let's get some of the specifics on the table. Like, I was interested in your theme of addiction and the way media and advertising feed into a kind of addiction in children, whether it's through violence, sexuality, food, gaming, or other factors. Would you talk a little bit about this addiction phenomenon?
Sure. I mean, I think a number of things are happening at the same time. One is that kids are simply consuming more media, and they have many more platforms to consume it on. When I say they're consuming more media, the Kaiser Family Foundation recently did a study and found that children spend on average 8 to 10 hours a day consuming commercial media. Now, it's no longer just a television set in the living room, but they're consuming commercial media now on multi-platforms, and they're highly interactive platforms. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is this concept of addiction to, for example, gaming, or to social media platforms like Facebook. And I'm willing to acknowledge that perhaps this is a different kind of addiction than when we're talking about substance addiction, and that, you know, the major medical bodies, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, they haven't yet recognized these as true addictions. But I think you can acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that behaviorally, kids are becoming quite obsessive in how they use some of these platforms. And what I look at in the book is the very calculated way that, for example, game designers or the designers of social media actually try to promote this compulsive behavior. Probably the sort of holy grail of game designers is a piece by a fellow named John Hobson called Behavioral Game Design. And he goes back to Skinnerian psychology, behaviorist psychology, you know, the old, if you put a rat in a cage and you put a piece of cheese at the end on a lever, will they push the lever? And he basically mines that psychology for the fundamental principles of how do you promote compulsive and addictive behavior in animals. Mm-hmm. And he says what game designers need to do, and indeed what they do, is apply those to the games that they design, so that you keep, you know, increasing the reward, and you do the kinds of things that a rat in a cage will push the lever for, to get kids to keep pushing the lever, so to speak.
I'm afraid sometimes that the greatest investment in affecting human behavior isn't in the constructive field like education, but it's in advertising, marketing, salesmanship, and other ways that the profit motive is applied to controlling people's behavior. And advertising displaces philosophy or religion as a guiding light in people's lives. Certainly, there's no denying that the addiction to food has resulted in childhood obesity and problems related to that. Another health issue you talk about is how the pharmaceutical industry has introduced itself into the world of childhood with this on-label and off-label prescriptions and the redefining of what disease is.
No, absolutely. I think, you know, when you look at the stats, it's very hard to dispute that there has been an explosion of use among children and prescription to children of very powerful psychotropic drugs. If you go back to 1980, and I trace this history in the book, the notion of child psychiatry was barely on the table. The notion that there were specific illnesses for children was barely on the table. And the idea that you would medicate a child, maybe some teenagers would be medicated, but the notion of medicating a young child was not on the table. And now you go forward 30 years and you see just a huge explosion of the use of stimulants for ADHD and ADD before that. Increasing numbers of diagnoses like pediatric bipolar, like pediatric obsessive compulsive social anxiety, and so on, all of which are being seen as treatable with drugs. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is not that it's never legitimate to medicate a child. I mean, I think that is an extreme position and probably wrong. And nor am I denying that there have been some real advances in the detection of mental illness in children, and that we as a society have become sort of better at recognizing it as an illness rather than a moral failing. All of that I agree with, but I also don't think it can be denied that a major factor in this explosion of drug use among children is the intervention and influence of pharmaceutical companies trying to grow their markets. And I show various ways in which this is done, various quite unethical ways in which pharmaceutical companies have begun to influence research, how they influence publishing, how, for example, and this was a horrible story back in the early 2000s, the studies of certain pharmaceutical companies were revealing that the drugs, their psychotropic drugs, when used by children, could increase suicidal thinking and suicidal risk. They buried those studies. They simply didn't publish them until, due to court cases related to some other issues, these documents came into court. And it was a huge scandal. And it basically goes back to some of the issues I talk about in the corporation. If you're a pharmaceutical company, your job is to make a profit for your shareholders, and that's your only job. If you do a study and it shows that your product is perhaps increasing suicidal behavior in children, but you want to sell those drugs to children, don't publish the study. There's no law that says you have to publish the study, so bury it.
You talk about British Columbia specifically with respect to child labor and childhood poverty. Would you review some of the findings that you express in the book about those topics?
The findings are quite shocking, and that is when you look at the United States, for example, the minimum age for work in the general economy is 14. The minimum age in agriculture is 12. When you look at the UN's minimum wage treaty, which is signed on to by a majority of the world's nations, including some of the poorest nations like Afghanistan and Haiti, the minimum age for work is 15. When you look at the province of British Columbia, the minimum age for work in any industry except a bar, a tavern, or a mine is 12, which distinguishes us in the world as one of the most underprotective jurisdictions in terms of child labor. The question, of course, is, does this mean more kids are working in the province? And I'm currently involved with a group that is looking at this question, doing a sort of big study across the province, trying to track exactly what areas kids are working in and how many are working and so on and so forth, to really get a concrete sense of the effect of this law, because that work hasn't been done yet. What we do know is that from the time that this law was introduced by the Gordon Campbell Liberal government in 2004, reducing the age from 15 to 12 in the province, until 2010, there was a 10% increase in the number of 12 to 14-year-old kids getting injured in the workforce. And we know that from statistics that are kept on injuries in the workplace. So I think we can roll back and deduce from that there are substantially more kids working in the workforce if that many more are getting injured.
Well, as a former teacher and teaching professor, I was distressed at the amount of time my students were spending at jobs. I think a job is fine. A limited amount of work for a kid in high school or college is fine. It's probably healthy. But when it gets to 25 and 30 hours a week and they're trying to be a student and they're falling asleep in the morning in their classes and they have no time for homework, it's not fine. And I see in my lifetime how society's changed on this score and has encouraged young people to work more and more to where clearly there's a cost in what they can be doing during the school day and at home when they're supposed to be doing some preparation.
Either preparation or just relaxing or learning to play the violin or being a member of the rugby team at their high school. I mean, there are so many things that we want kids to experience, and the notion that they're involved in some kind of job that really isn't serving any, whether it's flipping hamburgers or whatever. I think it's problematic, and I think it's an important distinction that's made by people in this area between children working and child labor. Mm-hmm. Child labor captures this notion that what they're doing is benefiting employers, it's giving them money, but it's not serving their interests. And whereas children working can serve their interests. I mean, you know, they can make some money, learn responsibility, all of that, but it's a balance. And I agree with you that we seem to be moving more towards a model where we're accepting child labor in contexts where it really isn't serving their interests.
Thank you. We'll be back in a moment.
So we see it in our curriculums, we see it in our school policies, we see it that the schools in many ways have become a reflection of the politics of the Western world. We have identified particular school subjects at the expense of other ones because they're seen as being better for the individual to be successful. And if you're measuring success in terms of economics, then true.
What is a school? What does a school look like based on the ethic of care?
How can a teacher maintain an ethical, caring relationship with 30 or 40 kids at any given time?
What do you teach? How do you teach it? You know, do you just go into school and teach about care? Of course not, because you still have academic expectations of reading and writing and arithmetic.
How do we then promote a culture of caring or a consciousness? That's what this project or this journey has been about.
Joel, one of our central interests on this program is K-12 education, and a segment of your book is dedicated to topics in K-12. So I'd like you to review for the audience, who I know are going to buy the book and read all about it, some of the themes that you pick up about K-12 education.
I guess the central theme in the two chapters that I devote to the issue of K-12 education is that, especially in the United States, there is a tendency towards effectively privatizing public education. But when I say privatizing, what I really mean is corporatizing. There's this notion that the problem with public schools is that they're not run like private institutions, that the crisis in education is a result of schools not being run along the principles of private markets, and that the solution is to bring private market models to schools. The solution is to bring corporations into the direct partnerships with public districts in delivering education. The solution is to abandon the ambition to try to provide liberal educations to many students and simply focus on training them for careers. So what I see in the United States, and I always think it's important to keep track of what's going on down there because it may not be that far from us having to deal with these issues. What I see in the United States is really a true abandonment of the ideals and practices and institutions of public education that we've taken for granted at least until the 1990s.
I see a parallel here in British Columbia and BC Hydro. If you're not going to take something over outright, you saddle it with debt and commit it to contracts that may not be favorable with private entities, and you achieve a similar effect without the political fallout of actually privatizing it.
Or, you know, you defund schools to the point where they become absolutely dysfunctional, as they are in America's inner cities, many of America's inner cities, because they depend, unlike in Canada, and I think we're way ahead on this, they depend on local tax revenue, local property tax revenues. Well, you know, if you're in the South Bronx and you're depending on local property tax revenues in a very deflated real estate market, you're not going to be having very much money to fund your schools with. So you drive them into the ground and then you say, see, public schooling doesn't work. So now we need to bring in private partners. So now what we're going to do is turn those public schools into career academies. So this school is going to partner with the restaurant industry and is basically going to train students to work in basically low-wage jobs in the restaurant industry, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, let's stand back from this a little bit and try and identify what's going on. I mean, are we romantics to think that there was ever a golden age, or has something actually changed, or are we sensitized in a way we weren't before? Standing back and looking at it from a broad perspective, what's going on in society, that things that we took for granted, like a public school and a protection of children, would be so severely eroded?
Something has changed, and I think what has changed, and I'm not the only person making this argument, is that we've become a fundamentalist society when we used to be a much more heterogeneous society. I think the original deal, when you look at the historical emergence of the corporation and of market capitalism, what you see is an initial kind of crazy heyday where it's let's just make as much money as we can, no regulation, just allow the free market to do its thing. And then you start to see, beginning in the early 20th century, you start to see a sense of, this market system works really well at doing one thing, namely creating wealth and creating jobs, but it doesn't do a very good job at ensuring other public interests are protected. So let's create public schools. Let's ensure that we can instill in kids some sense of citizenship rather than just sending them into mines when they're 12 years old. Let's talk about protecting labor. Let's create collective bargaining legislation. Let's create environmental legislation, human rights. So let's create a balance. Let's say, on the one hand, we have the market, which does this great job of pooling capital and creating wealth. On the other hand, we can't allow it to just sort of run without any constraints, because it will turn all these other interests, it will grind them up and grind them down. So let's create a balance. What has happened in our society is that we've forgotten about that balance. We've forgotten about the deal, the quid pro quo, that we're willing to create a market to create wealth so long as we have safeguards to protect other public interests and allow us to be a civil, decent, good society where people can live decent lives and be democratic citizens and all of that good stuff.
Well, 2008 seems to have proven that markets aren't self-correcting. And
Well,
Alan
absolutely.
Greenspan
Alan
even
Greenspan
has
acknowledged
admitted
it.
And yet, where are we now? It seems like the page hasn't been turned.
It's baffling to me. That's all I can say, that somehow we continue to buy into the notion that the reason for 2008 and the reason why the page hasn't been turned, according to many people in the Republican Party in the US and their fellow travelers here, is because we're over-regulating, because there's just so much mythology out there, and I wish I knew why it was so powerful and effective.
Do you see an alternate politics or set of beliefs for the processing of democratic ideals that would get us out of the box we're in?
One of the really, happy and optimistic things that I found in doing my research for this book was that there are a lot of people who are really trying to do things to turn these things around in numerous different places, in numerous different ways, at local levels, in the House of Commons in Canada and Congress in the United States. That it's not that we've totally lost sight of these things, and there are many people, and I believe, we're looking at the rise of the Occupy Everything movement, and their slogan is 99%. I don't know if that's a scientifically verifiable number, but I do believe that most people want much the same thing, which is some security in their lives, some ability for them and their kids to flourish as human beings, some reasonable balance of these competing values that we've been talking about. And so I don't think it's a very radical proposition to move us to something that is a lot better than what we currently have. Because what we currently have I don't see as sustainable, economically, environmentally, or in terms of how we're raising children.
So I hear you saying that there is the possibility of grassroots mobilization coming about around new ideas with probably the support of the internet, because we have this great free open communication vehicle we never had before that could start to crystallize an alternative set of practices to what we've been describing, which is often called neoliberalism.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I don't think it's only the grassroots. I also think it's happening in large P politics. You know, one of the issues I deal with is this issue of toxins and children's health. And, you know, there's a senator, a Democratic senator in the U.S. from Florida named Frank Lautenberg, who has proposed really quite progressive legislation. He's trying to get enough people. It's difficult with a Republican Congress, but he's out there. He's fighting the fight. And, you know, we look at the success in the last federal election of a party that has a lot of these values, the NDP. We look at Jack Layton as a person articulating them and the degree to which he mobilized the public. So I think it's the grassroots, and it's also within the traditional structures of our democratic governance that we can find these. How exactly to get those movements to undo what has been done over the last 30 years, that's the $64,000 question.
Well, thanks. But some of the answers in Childhood Under Siege.
I hope.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back in a moment. The interview you have just heard emerges from one of the best effects of universities: reflection, considered thought, careful analysis of ideas and events, skepticism, appropriate doubt. Universities foster reflection, study, experiment, research, creativity. Even so, the path of progress is replete with complexity, error, and false starts. We do better as a society if we have scholars and researchers at work, and if their creative and scientific insights are disseminated and put to use. We don't know how to make this knowledge transfer go efficiently or quickly. Canada has been making this effort systematic, however, for much of a decade. One old-fashioned, low-tech way that the word gets out is in a book. Today's interview illustrates the effectiveness of a committed scholar examining social events and writing down his ideas for reform. I am grateful to the authors of such books. They are a civilizing force. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters.